So, is this a turning point? Is it the day the media fought back? Across the US, 350 papers synchronise editorials rebutting President Trump's unrelenting attacks on a critical media. Here's the Kansas City Star, for instance, rounding on Trump today for his calling the media the enemy of the people. That's what the Nazis called Jews, says the paper. That's how Stalin marked out his victims for murder.
We have had at least 5 journalists killed this year, several of them murdered. We have seen at least 4 sources who are alleged to have provided classified information to journalists who are being prosecuted. We have seen promises, rhetorical promises, to open up libel laws.
Donald Trump, though, is having none of it, tweeting today, "The fact is that the press is free to write and say anything it wants, but much of what it says is fake news, pushing a political agenda, or just plain trying to hurt people. Honesty wins." In the past 2 hours, the US Senate has weighed in, unanimously ruling that the media are not the enemy of the people and are vital to democracy.
Now, both parties complain about the media, but who could argue with Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost.
Aggressive politics, aggressive rhetoric.
This sleazy guy right over here from ABC, he's a sleaze in my book.
From the Trump election campaign onwards.
The fake media tried to stop us from going to the White House, but I'm president and they're not.
And it all leads, say Trump's critics, to murder ultimately. 4 journalists and a media worker shot dead at the Capitol newspaper in Maryland just last month. The White House quizzed, in the nation of the First Amendment guaranteeing free speech, does the president believe the media really are the enemy of the people?
I appreciate your passion. I share it. I've addressed this question. I've addressed my personal feelings.
That, you note, was not a denial. Behind today's unprecedented editorial unity also lies the concern that Donald Trump's approach greenlights the world's despot. Does it make life easier for Turkey's President Erdogan to lock up hundreds of journalists in recent months? Or for Bangladesh's government to arrest journalists and shut down newspapers it doesn't like, whilst beating protesters from the streets?
If you destroy my country, I'll kill you.
Donald Trump hailed his great relationship with the Philippine hardman, President Duterte, who has long harassed media critics.
It's great to be with you.
And then there's the president's favourite president, Mr. Putin. Scores of journalists murdered during his grip on power, and pretty much all mass media in Russia under the thumb of the Kremlin.
The anti-press rhetoric that is emanating from the White House and from the President of the United States is providing succor to those autocrats who would be happy to restrict independent reporting, and it's providing, justification for efforts to repress journalism in a range of countries.
So, a real turning point today? Well, in a business noted for competition, not cooperation, 350 editorials saying enough is enough matters. Not least in a democracy where discourse, conversation between the media and the executive should matter, but is drowned out by this endless shouting match.
Alex Thomson. Well, joining me now from New York is assistant editor of the Wall Street Journal, James Freeman, whose paper did not take part in today's campaign, and from Boston, managing director of the Boston Globe, Linda Henry. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, James. 350 papers across the United States took part in this campaign today. Your paper, the august Wall Street Journal, wasn't one of them. Why not?
Thank you. Well, we do prize our independence. I think that's true of a lot of papers, and also true of a number that did not participate, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and I think the Los Angeles Times made some good points today, saying that they don't believe in groupthink. They want to speak independently and based on their own good judgment.
But do you agree with the fact that President Trump has been laying into the press with particular ferocity?
He has been laying into the press with ferocity. He does make a distinction that he's talking, when he says the enemy of the people, he's talking about fake news, not news generally. I wish he wouldn't use the term at all. On the other hand, I think comparing him to Stalin is kind of laughable. And I think one thing that his critics in the press should think about, who have also been laying into him with a great deal of ferocity, is I think they ought to really consider that Mr. Trump is really been treated by a standard very different from his predecessors. And in fact, his predecessor, in terms of really infringing freedom of the press, based on the record so far, was much more aggressive. Barack Obama's government secretly surveilled journalists, went into their emails. If you want to talk about a threat to our First Amendment,
but
which
he
is
never
our freedom to say what we believe.
He never called them scumbags. He never used them, rather like Christians in the Colosseum, at his rallies. He never declared war on them in the same way. And that kind of rhetoric, surely, is corroding American democracy and is worthy of some groupthink.
Mr. Obama was very critical of Fox News, but you're right. He was not. He did not use the tough language that Mr. Trump uses. I wish Mr. Trump used different language, but Barack Obama his government went into reporters' emails, secret subpoenas targeting the Associated Press and others. So I think the real threat to free speech, and I should tell you, our First Amendment, which we treasure here, does not say the government can't criticize us as members of the press. What it says is that it cannot infringe on our ability to do our job.
Okay, Linda Henry, let me turn to you in Boston. You heard James Freeman there saying that, it's a free country, it's a free press. We don't choose to have these editorials on the front page, and that's okay. And by the way, the Washington Post didn't either.
Well, the Washington Post said that they had already opined on this, so they didn't need to. There are so many things to talk about here. Thank you so much for having me on today. One of the things that James was talking about Obama, I don't know why we're not talking about that. What we're talking about today, what these newspapers are talking about, is the rhetoric, and that there is a cost to this rhetoric that's going on. And it is fine. There are newspapers who wrote against this today, but there are 350 media outlets who said in their own words what journalism means. And normally we feel that we don't need to explain what the function of the press is. And this was an opportunity, because what the function of the press is in Boston is very different from what the function of the press is in Boise.
But the problem is that the American, sorry for interrupting, the problem is that the American media landscape, not so much actually in newspapers, but especially on cable television, is hopelessly tribal and divided. And when the president says that, MSNBC, the liberal channel, or indeed CNN, which was once in the middle ground, is laying into him, relentlessly, he kind of has a point as well, doesn't he?
Criticizing the press is fine. You're welcome. We deserve. We didn't cover something enough. We covered something too much. That is all welcome criticism. Just as there is welcome criticism for any person in power, any political leader, there's welcome criticism for what they're doing as well. That's fine. There is a very big difference, though, in the dehumanization of calling somebody the enemy of the people, the opposition party. That affects journalists and what they do in all levels.
But is the danger here, Linda Henry, that the president has dragged the press down into the gutter, and everyone is now basically laying into each other, and it's very difficult to find any honest or neutral brokers?
No, what this project was about was having media organizations, in their own words, talk about why they do, what they serve. And the editorials were incredible. They talked about how we're your friends, we're your neighbors, we're fellow Americans, our kids are in the same schools. It's it's this connection and realization of who we are and what it is that the press is doing. This was not a unified. I'm sorry, I'm getting feedback.
Okay,
this wasn't a unified.
Of course, we've got to leave there. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. But Linda Henry, thank you very much indeed. James Freeman, thanks very much indeed in New York.